see all the different elements come together, because the strange thing about polearms is they play best at two distances: the long distance fight and a belly-to-belly wrestling fight. Okay. For example, when Fiore de Libri teaches the Poleaxe, he says, constantly references the dagger fight, right? More than he does any other section of the manuscript, he references the dagger fight. So that's something that's important to understand. Now, this class is going to be on the Bolognese polearm tradition, essentially. So we're looking at late 15th through early 17th century polearms. And that's important because we have a lot of material, which is great. We also have a lot of transition going on. And we have essentially two different types of fight with polearms to deal with. We have polearms that work well for essentially common soldier, fighting in lines, fighting in pike squares, for formation fighting, and that dictates elements of how you can use the weapon, elements of wanting to maintain a very narrow facing. And so essentially those polearms become very much, I think the best way to think of it is a spear with benefits. Okay? And then we have elements of what we could think of as more chivalric polearms, the quintessential one of which, of course, is the Poleaxe. Weapons that are certainly usable in that context, but are also optimized for individual combat in the list. Now, having said that, all these different masters all clearly have their polearm with their gewgaws that they like a little better. So somebody may teach the bill and extol the virtues of the bill, and someone else may have nearly identical actions and talk about the halberd. Okay. I'm going to briefly talk about the main polearms of the tradition. Sadly, had Tom made it, he has examples, including original examples of almost all of these. I don't, nor do we have trainers for every form, so that's fine. We can get through most of the material. I'll describe the weapons, and some of the very specialized ones, we're just not going to be able to look at plays from because we don't have long forward curve tines on a stick. Okay. So basically the root of polearm combat is the spear. In Germany, they make it even simpler and turn the root of all polearm combat into just a simple, humble staff. But so everything builds off of the spear. In terms of how you think about it and how you teach it. And then from the spear, you have two principal divisions that start appearing in the 15th century in Italy and really come into their own in the 16th. The first is the spiedo, which is, I think, also called a spadum. What the spiedo is it is a very, very long thrusting spear. So the heads on them can be like this. Not a cutting weapon at all, purely thrusting. And it has two long forward curved tines. Okay? Basically, it looks like a gigantic scythe at the end of a stick. And so it really takes that idea of the spear as a thrusting weapon and simply gives it the ability to trap and block other weapons and bear them to the ground. In a different direction, we have the partisan. The partisan is basically a short sword on the end of a stick. So it adds the cut. The partisan's a really interesting weapon for the Bolognese masters, not just because it's a fun thing to hit people with, but because of why it becomes so popular. It gives you a little insight into the Renaissance mind. And the reason for this is that, to their mind, the partisan was a weapon that was similar to the ancient heroic Greek spear. Okay? So to their mind, with the whole return to classical combat and classical culture, this is the sort of weapon that certainly Achilles must have been using, and this and all the others. So much so that you see the partisan used sometimes with the rotella, right, which is the arm-strapped round shield. And one of the common ways, for example, a judicial duel with the partisan is fought, is we get two slightly smaller, lighter ones because we're going to hurl one of them like a javelin and then fight partisan shield. shield. Now, if you've ever handled a real partisan, you know, you got to be a mensch to fight with that thing in a reverse grip with a shield. They balance extremely well, but it still is a fair bit of muscle. We will not be doing partisan at Rotella today because I could not do it justice, but I'm sure hoping that someone will pick it up and play with it because I would love to see it reconstructed. So the partisan is a slashing weapon. It is often thought of as having two short little wings. It's basically the descendant of what Christian was beating me over the head with at the bead until it broke. It does not have to have those wings. Many partisans just have a huge, basically short sword blade. Both of those weapons are traditionally, according to the masters, should be about the length of a man extending his arm over his head, okay? Or that length plus the head of the weapon. So you get, yeah.
Sorry, I own 2 original partisans, and I just wanted to mention how thick they're like a short sword, except in addition to being this wide above the lugs, they're an inch thick. There's a lot of metal in that head.
Yes, and I think what's important to understand is that this is a weapon that is considered to be armor piercing. Now, sounds an armor. That doesn't mean that you're driving this straight through the center of somebody's breastplate necessarily. But it does mean it's a weapon that, for example, is considered more than capable of ripping through a fall, of piercing, biting, and being used to lever somebody over, or piercing a visor in a way that other weapons aren't necessarily thought of. Okay? So it was considered a very formidable weapon. And so once we get into those weapons now, we need a few extra techniques because now we're getting into cutting. So our next evolution out of that is the Italian bill, which is called the ronca. And the ronca is basically a long, very long blade with a forward hook. It is not like an English bill, which sort of looks like an imitated Halberd. It's a much leaner weapon and a little bit more elegant weapon. And we'll talk about the ronca a little bit today and what you use that back hook for. It uses some of the most awful techniques in the system, in part because the people fighting with the ronca are usually, not always, but usually commoners and may or may not have gauntlets. And in the period we're talking about, if they do, they're usually scale gauntlets. So there's a lot of little techniques that are designed specifically to ruin their hands, okay, to ruin their hands. And then the hook has its own benefits, additional benefits. And then we come to the big two, which are the halberd and the poleaxe, which I sort of think of as the knightly equivalent and the footman's equivalent, respectively. Halberds and poleaxes often get mistaken for each other by people who don't know them well until you pick one up, because they feel very, very different. So halberd is longer, generally. Doesn't have to be, but generally. It has a notably larger axe blade, whereas the poleaxe may not even have an axe blade, it may have a hammer. The forward spike is usually quite long, and it not always, but usually has a back hook, not a rear hammer. Whereas the poleaxe can have a hammer or a hook on the back, it can have a hammer or an axe blade in the front. It tends to be a little shorter. Having said that, in the 16th century, poleaxes start to get really long. Monte says that he sees axes being used now that can be as much as 7 or 8 feet long. And then he makes it somewhat, and he says, so you better know how to use it because you may need to in speed. And he says, but really, the reason people favor these axes is so that they can stand at the barriers and fight each other from a great distance and gain honor without risking harm. So he's a little, yeah, okay. I guess if you need 8 feet, the poleaxe, fine. However, when we look at the poleaxe techniques that we have from the Bolognese tradition, understand that unlike Fiore's axe, which works very well with a small axe, like a little 4.5-foot axe, up to about man height, for the Bolognese material, the 16th century material, you want an axe that is about your height or a little bigger. It's a longer weapon. because there's a number of actions where I have something going on in one line, a high line at the same time that I'm doing something on the low line. So it does require a slightly longer axe. Okay. So these are the weapons of the tradition. The other thing that's interesting is we get some advice from Bonaventura Pistofilo about what kind of hafts these weapons should have. And first of all, the answer is none of them should be round. Most of ours are round. And he has a distinct preference for what gets an octagonal haft and what gets a rectangular haft. Basically, if the weapon primarily thrusts, it gets an octagonal haft. And if the weapon is meant to strike strongly, it gets a rectangular haft. And he says that's simply because it's much easier in harness to know the orientation of the weapon at all times. And I can tell you from experience, that is true as hell, that when everything's on a round stick, you don't have any clue where your weapon head or those hooks have gone. You just don't with your visor down. I've played with octagonal hafts, and I think they're generally better, but I will say, having done more and more with Poleaxe and rectangular hafts, they really do give you the cleanest feel for always knowing where that axe is oriented. So who am I to argue with someone who actually did this for a living? That's the breakdown, okay? And then he says, and a lot of discussion is made of langets and their importance. And he says, I think they're very important because they keep your weapon alive longer. And he says, but I also think it is overrated that anyone except someone else using a halberd will strike off the head of a halberd. Basically, his opinion is that it happens through attrition in the battlefield, and it's going to happen anyway. And that people boasting about basically splitting shafts with single blows and whatnot and two-handed swords. So apparently, the point is, it was something of a mythos, even in he's writing in 1620. And he's saying, the langets are important because they make the life of the weapon longer, not because any one person is routinely going to do this. And they'll fail when they fail and just get over it. They're made out of wood, it happens. Okay? So any questions about the context of what we're going to talk about? Okay. Next question. How many of you were in the spear class with Devin and I yesterday? Okay. So, for you guys, the first part of the class is going to be a bit of a rerun as we look at basic pairing positions and guards. And here's how we're going to handle this. We're going to start off with simple fundamentals that are universal, starting with the spear. Then what we're going to do is we're going to look at weapons that tend to fight point forward, but do other things and add some benefits. Then we're going to take a look at weapons that like to smack people up the side of the head. And then we're going to wrap with the poleaxe. So I'm kind of, in some ways, I'm starting with an early weapon, going through later weapons, and back to an earlier weapon. The reason for that is that poleaxe, in my opinion, is really the Swiss Army knife of polearms. Because you have butt strokes with the other weapons, you have hooks and pull downs, but the poleaxe changes measures so quickly and uses both ends so much more that it's a nice way to capstone it. Because if you can use that and you can use the spear well, you can pick up any other polearm and make it work. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and get started.
Well, if we're doing it last, and if we did the spear yesterday, we could run and do it. I just want to say, Greg, my original partisan